value the time that you put into that. And the chapters will be in the chat. I think Jacqueline agreed should put the chapters in the chat so you can write those down there. So thank you. This week, we're focusing on decolonizing the field, the discipline, the practice of psychology. Extraordinarily interesting and important topic. We're lucky to have Dr. Sylvie Taylor, who has many roles, including heading up our community psych program at Los Angeles. She's also on the anti-racism task force for the university and many, many, many other things with just years of experience in thinking about and helping people to practice decolonizing the field of psychology. So really grateful to have her here and to be in conversation with her. What we're going to do is I've got a handful of questions that I'm going to toss her way, and then she's going to do whatever she wants, which seems like an appropriate way to do that. But I wanted to start just real quickly. I don't want to take up her time, but with just two quotations. When I think about decolonizing anything, I can't not think of Frantz Fanon. And his extraordinary work in decolonization. Here's a quick quotation from him way back in the day where he's addressing social scientists. And he says, "So comrades, let us not pay tribute to Europe by creating states and institutions and societies that draw their inspiration from Europe. For Europe and for ourselves and for all of humanity, comrades, we must make a new start, develop a new way of thinking, and endeavor to create a new human." So that's in the African context that Fanon is writing. Real quickly, in our North American context, Martin Luther King, back in 1967, challenged psychologists to decolonize psychology. And here's a quick quotation from him. 1967, if the Negro needs social sciences for direction and self-understanding, the white society is even in more urgent need. White America needs to understand that it is poisoned to its soul by racism, and the understanding needs to be carefully documented and consequently more difficult to reject. The present crisis arises because although it is historically imperative that our society take the next step to equality, we find ourselves psychologically imprisoned. And he ends that speech by calling for the formation of a new organization, the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. And I think of decolonizing as creative maladjustment. So there you go. Sylvie, good to see you. Thank you for being here. And my first question for you is, to help those of us that may not understand fully what we mean by colonizing, decolonizing, in what ways is psychology in the US marked by coloniality?
Okay, so thank you all for having me. I've been looking forward to this and I'm thinking, how fast can I talk? Because I got a lot to say. I've been doing a lot of this work with departments across the United States. I'm on the departmental consulting group for the American Psychological Association. So I visited about 50 programs in the United States in the last 10 years, helping them figure out what to do with their curriculum. And I think that, one of the things that we have to acknowledge and that we often don't, and this is true in psychology, but it is true in American higher education. We are a product of the colonization largely of our planet. If you look at the planet that we live on, the vast majority of well, all of North and South America, the African continent, much of Southeast Asia has been colonized by European countries and brings forward the values, the attitudes, the scripture, the mindset that comes from that. And if we look at psychology, I did this a little bit this afternoon. I was like, what would happen if you just do a Google search of most famous psychologists? You know, you're going to end up with Freud and Piaget and Erikson and Skinner and Bandura and Rogers and Maslow. It's all mostly white men, many of whom were in Europe, right? And those become the voices that have crafted this field. You know, I was looking at that search. There were only 3 women, you know, Mary Ainsworth, you know, her work, you know, extraordinary, however, rooted in a Western notion of what a family is and how parents should interact with their children. And we also have a lot of research that looks at this. I remember when I was in graduate school, so, you know, I was in graduate school in the 1980s, and the hot book at the time, late 80s, early 90s, the hot book at the time, which was already had already been written in the 1970s, was Guthrie's Even the Rat Was White, talking about how research in psychology is largely about people of European descent in this country who are white. In 2010, there were 2 published articles, one in Nature, which I strongly encourage people to read, by Heinrich, talking about how we're not all weirdos. And he uses the acronym that research in the social sciences in this country, and particularly in psychology, studies weird people, namely people who are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And that has shaped the canon of what we understand to be psychology. And then Jeffrey James Arnett comes along and writes an article for the American Psychologist in the same year called The Neglected 95%, that the population of the United States, which makes up about 5% of the world, generates the majority of the research in psychology and ignores the rest of the world. So our understandings of functioning, how we look at the world, is largely based on the experience of people who are weird, for lack of a better term. And that has enormous implications, not only for research, but for the practice of psychology in this country and beyond, because we reify things that are highly encapsulated in a cultural point of view. You know, it's interesting from a research perspective. I attended a talk that Ibram Kendi was giving, who's doing a lot of the work on anti-racism. And he used a wonderful example to talk about this from a research perspective, because we always reify research as objective, right? There's nothing subjective about research as long as we blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, you know, not so fast, because if we look, for example, at the COVID pandemic, there are many people who will ask the question, well, we know that there's disproportionate impact of COVID on populations of color. And the natural question is, what is it about those people that makes them more at risk? Rather than asking a question, what are the systems and structures of our society that contribute to that result? Very different kind of question. So when we locate colonialism and the decolonization of psychology, we're really trying to think about power and the social structures of the culture that influence our academic disciplines, the work that we do as clinicians, and so forth. So, hope that answers your question, David.
Spot on. Brilliant. So when we then think about the processes, the methodologies, and so on of decolonizing, all the literature foregrounds this insistence on the voices, the experiences, the creative, erotic, spiritual energy of those who've not been part of the conversation, of those who've been marginalized, as Fanon says, the damné, the damned. So in the field of psychology, what would that look like to refocus and include those that have been excluded?
I think it's funny as you ask this question, because of the questions that you want to pose to me, this is the most provocative. And I think for those of us who are engaged in this work, that kind of notion and idea that we need to study marginalized populations has actually, as we've done this work, been characterized as a recapitulation of colonization.
Yeah.
That we're basically loosely defining culture. We're not all clear what that means. And then we fetishize, we exoticize, let's go learn and study those strange and exotic people who don't do things the way that it should be done, that don't live their lives using that reference point, which is so deeply ingrained in sort of Western epistemology, right? We look at the world and we think about it in ways that are directly tied to ignoring the power hierarchies, which is what we need to do if we're going to decolonize. And instead, we kind of go, let's look at these populations that are not like the reference points that we have created. So what ends up happening, and the things that folks who are talking about the decolonizing of the field and the curriculum, is to sort of think about I'm going to talk about three main areas that we need to dismantle. Okay, so one of them is dichotomous thinking, right? We do everything in binary. We do gender that way, but we also do white, non-white, straight, not straight, Christian, not Christian, etc. We do this, with all groups. And when we're talking specifically about race, right, that white, non-white, and that has been historically the reference point. So when we do that, we often create essentialism in the way that we're seeing things. Psychology is replete with textbooks. My favorite, which drives me crazy, because Daryl Wing Su, who is kind of the modern father of microaggressions, actually wrote a text a number of years ago called Counseling the Culturally Different. Think about that for a minute. If I say that something is different from something else, then there's a reference point, and all these other people are different. So people of color are different. Book chapters that are like working with Latinx, or working with Latinos and Hispanics, working with Asian Americans. What does that mean? I mean, if you think about it, the Asian Americans are not a uniform population. We're talking about people who may have been here for generations, coming from very distinct cultures with distinct histories. Vietnam is not China, is not Japan, is not South Korea, is not North Korea, right? Yet we kind of lump everybody in to a category because the colonial mindset is essentialism. There's us and them. So we put them in a group, and then we treat that group as if everyone in that group is the same. For people who have linguistic capacity, for example, in a language other than English, right? So I speak French and Spanish fluently. Depending on who you're talking to, I speak Spanish fluently. I cannot understand people who are native of Puerto Rico. They just speak too fast. And there are people who are native speakers of Spanish from other parts of the world, like, I have no idea what you're saying, right? And there are colloquialisms that exist in, Spanish that is spoken in the rural south of Mexico that is considered a personal affront if you're from Argentina, right? So this kind of idea that we create this essentialist perspective of who people are. And then the other aspect of this that I think is highly problematic is that we often focus on communities of color in particular, but any marginalized group by their marginalization and nothing beyond that. So we're not fully appreciating people's humanity, that, you know, these are human beings. You know, we're watching this play out. I was watching the closing arguments of the Chauvin trial earlier today, and it was impressive. One of the things that was impressed upon me is how many times the prosecuting attorney said the word human, because the jury needs to be reminded that he was a human being. And when we engage in this dichotomous thinking and essentialism and marginalization for marginalization's sake, it is the end product is often the dehumanization of people on that we're looking at. And that's a vestige of colonization, because in order to rape and pillage the countryside, take people's resources, deny them their culture, deny them their language, their food, their religions, their history, and their traditions, they had to be seen as less than human in order to achieve that. And that's what was done. And that was what has been done worldwide. So now here we are centuries later trying to deconstruct this, which is not an easy thing to do. So when we think about decolonizing, what we're really trying to do is not cast our gaze down, if you will, and look at these disparate communities, but cast our gaze upward to the power hierarchy and to look at what are the inequities and inequalities that are deeply embedded in the systems of power and privilege within our culture, and how do those things play themselves out in our discipline.
Brilliant, and I'm glad you liked that question, and went all the places that you did with it. It reminds me, right, that you know, foregrounding the experience of those who have been marginalized, not included, didn't have a seat at the table, has its complexities, and isn't necessarily a good thing, right? I think about the commissions in the 60s, you know, Kerner and Moynihan and all of that, and who they're going to go take seriously the voices of Black Americans, but when they do that, they see the Black family as pathological. Like they don't change, it doesn't change their lens.
Right.
So yeah. So
yeah,
more on that. Here you go. So let's make it practical. Let's think about Antioch. You know, how does Antioch, from where you sit, from your vantage point, participate in this coloniality of psychology, and what would be some just practical steps to begin to look at that and address that and overturn it?
So I want to preface what I'm going to say next by sort of saying, just so everybody knows, you know, I teach in the MA Psych program in the Los Angeles campus. So I certainly cannot speak for being intimately familiar with the curriculum of all of the other entities that have psychology across our system. So I just want to preface by saying that. I think though, in, you know, having spent the better part of the last 20 years as a faculty member on our campus, I think that there are a number of ways that this happens. I think that, you know, as we were talking earlier, I think a lot of the focus still continues to be in psychology, particularly in psychology that is intended to prepare people to be mental health practitioners, to really focus on these sort of notions of cultural competency and multiculturalism and diversity that are kind of that old school, let's go and study these populations and let's learn about how to work with this group or that group, and not looking at power and privilege and what that means, and how much uh, that knowledge can be used, can be weaponized, and it is weaponized. You know, you mentioned, for example, David, you know, the work of the Kerner Commission and, you know, the sort of notion of Black families and the pathologizing of Black families. That has been done to every group of ethnic minorities in this country, with this idea that somehow upper middle class white people have a lock on what it means to be a good parent. I'd like to remind people that the children of upper middle class white folks, their suicidality rate has jumped to 20% in the last decade. So I don't know, you know, I'm not putting my confidence necessarily there. Okay. So I think that when we look at what we are doing, I really frame this for myself and for other educators as an ethical responsibility as an educator, to be knowledgeable, to be mindful, and to be thoughtful about this. Because certainly my experience has often been with students, particularly when things become racialized in the classroom, that there's a very common way in which the narrative goes. A student who belongs to a marginalized group takes, you know, doesn't like something that's been said, or raises a concern about something that has been said or how it has been said. There is a reaction from the student who represents the majority. I didn't mean it. That's not, you're overreacting, blah, 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 blah. And then there is almost a knee-jerk reaction to do caretaking of the white student who was the offender, and the student of color is left out in the cold. And to me, that is pedagogical. That is about how do we understand how to give voice to everyone in the room and not to privilege one person's experience over another. And those kinds of encounters occur in, again, our reflection of that colonialism. Somehow, the pain of that person of color is not experienced as deeply as the offense taken by the student who may have misspoken, may have said something that was misinterpreted, etc. And I think that's a reflection of that. And I think realistically, our role and our work should be and needs to be, how do I, as an educator, figure that out? How do I work with that? That is my ongoing ethical responsibility. And I think one of the things that's unfortunate as educators, and certainly in the world of psychology, there's lots of different practitioners who are licensed, and there are requirements for continuing education and so on and so forth. We don't have that as university faculty. You know, we get to, you know, many of us get to finish a doctoral program and then boom, you're good to go. And nobody's ever going to really question what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're doing it. And no one's ever going to necessarily require you to become better at being a pedagogue. You know, that's often something that is self-directed. And I think that's a challenge. I think another challenge that we need to look at Antioch is, it is not sufficient to diversify a course by saying, I'm going to add a couple of articles written by some people as an add-on. You know, I'm going to add an article about Black people, an article about Latinx folks, an article about Asian Americans, and most of the time people completely forget people who are Indigenous, and then that somehow is going to suffice. That is not sufficient. That is not ethical, because often a remessaging happens. If I toss in a couple of articles written by people who have surnames that sound like they belong to some ethnic group other than Western European, and I never talk about it, I never analyze it, I never incorporate it into any of my assignments, et cetera, then what have I really done? I've re-marginalized that work and essentially said, it's really not that important. We're going to sit over here and talk about Freud till the cows come home, right? So it becomes essential that we see this as an ethical responsibility as educators, that we learn that which we don't know. And I think we also have to hold, ourselves and also hold the people who educated us to account. Because for most of us, nobody ever paid any attention to that. And people continue to not pay any attention to that. And we've created a canon in psychology that silences all voices or marginalizes voices that don't uphold what has been considered to be the gold standard of understanding in psychology. So I think that what we have to do is ask ourselves as educators two questions. What cultures and knowledges are subordinated through our applications of psychology and the work that we do? What voices are we not even acknowledging exist, right? Or which voices are subordinated and seen as less important? Because often the work of scholars of color, that work is often seen as, oh, that's this little offshoot. People have an axe to grind, so we'll look at that, and it's not held at the same level of importance. And I think the second question that we have to ask ourselves is, how have dominant paradigms of power and privilege influenced psychology? Right? How do we think about not only race, but Eurocentrism, patriarchy, heteronormativity, and then this sort of continuum that a lot of people are beginning to talk about, which is this sort of corporate, consumerist, capitalist continuum of how we see the world, right? And we have to ask ourselves those questions. And we should be asking ourselves those questions when we create a syllabus. We should be asking ourselves those questions when we walk into a classroom. We should be asking ourselves those questions when a student asks that provocative question and everybody gets a little uncomfortable. So I hope that answers your question, David.
Completely. Let's call it a day. No. But I'm really glad with the way that you're going at this, and I'll say, this in my coursework, as I've struggled to do many of the things that you're talking about, what I was good at was the sort of the way in which the Enlightenment tradition on into the modern age, how that influences the social sciences and many other things, but just that so it was philosophical, and as I've been challenged to think more along the lines of specifically decolonizing, then what jumps to the front for me is neoliberal globalization. And so now that economic paradigm that you were referring to at the end of your comments, it's the struggle to try to figure out, all right, so how do I work that in as well as the philosophical? Yeah.
Well, I mean, again, I think that one of the places where we have just extraordinary missed opportunity with that, again, the monetization of everything. I mean, I'm in a psych program. I haven't practiced as a clinician in 30 years. And, one of the things that I think about is, as much as psychologists and mental health professionals like to reify themselves as social justice oriented, et cetera, there isn't a single discipline in psychology that makes as part of its responsibility pro bono work. We like to talk about lawyers, but they do pro bono work as part of their ethical responsibility to serving the public. Where's that? And I've had that conversation at the American Psychological Association and other places. Well, you can't do that because and there's always some excuse, right? And the fact that, the disparities that exist, particularly in the provision of mental health services. So here's a statistic that makes me want to run out of the room with my hair on fire, because it's the same statistic that existed when I started my doctoral program at UCLA in 1988. if you are a Black or brown man in Los Angeles County who is low income, if you have the opportunity to receive any kind of psychological / psychiatric services, it will be medication only. Talk therapy for 90% of people is not available. You know, you go to the west side of LA, everybody and their cousin is in therapy or a therapist, right? And I say this with students all the time, have yet to meet somebody, very few and far between, people who really want to dedicate their lives to serving people who aren't going to pay them $200 an hour, right? And is that even an appropriate approach? I mean, I think that that's the other piece. We get into this one trick pony idea of the only way to deal with trauma and so on and so forth is to therapize people in a one-on-one room. That is antithetical to the traditions of many of the people that we're talking about. I mean, psychotherapy is, you want to talk about weird, right? I'm sitting in a room with somebody, they're not telling me anything about them. They want me to spill my guts to them. It is weird. It is a very strange thing. And it also, reinforces that individualistic perspective of how the world works, which is uniquely Western. The vast majority of people on the planet come from collective cultures. And one of the things that I think is so fascinating, and I'm pretty sure I'm accurate on this. I'm not saying that somebody told me this, but I'm pretty sure I'm accurate on this. The English language is the only language where the pronoun I is capitalized. Think about that for a minute. We are making ourselves really important as I, me, and mine, and losing track of we. And in many cases, we is far more important. And if we think about a transformative therapy, I mentioned this to a couple of people and got into a very heated argument with some folks a couple of weeks ago, with some folks that I do some of this decolonial work with. We were talking about this notion of I statements, which is the gold standard that gets taught to anybody. I talk in I statements. I feel blah, blah, blah when blah, 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 right? Okay. And don't point out you, it's all about me. I. And I raised the question, I said, it's a very different proposition if someone says, I feel attacked when we argue, versus when we argue, it is damaging to our relationship. That's a very different place to go. And for most people on the planet, that's closer to the way that people think and engage with each other. So I think, there's a lot of work that has to be done to begin to think about, particularly for people who are practitioners, what does that look like? Because all of the way that we see things is framed around that colonial idea. A family is nuclear, and a family is not only nuclear, but a real family, is, a boy and a girl who had babies the old fashioned way. I mean, like we still have these antiquated notions and knowledges. We still don't really have wide understanding within clinical psychology of allowing people to define whoever they want to define as family. These are traditions that are, particularly in Latinx and African-American communities, you got all kinds of aunts and uncles and comadres and compadres who are not blood relations, but they hold that status, yet that gets ignored, right? It often gets ignored. It's something that isn't really widely spoken about. Another example that people have talked about a great deal, right? Since all of this racialized stuff that's going on, and everybody's talking about the talk, right? And, families of color talking to their children about how to be safe in encounters with the police and so on and so forth. And I've seen over and over and over again, very clinical descriptions about this in the literature that doesn't capture the visceral experience of a parent having a life and death conversation with their child, because that's what it is. It's a lot, and make no mistake, it's not, don't run by the pool, although, don't run by the pool could be a life and death situation, but it's like you could be in this situation, and yes, it's not fair, and yes, it's not okay, and yes, you should have all the same rights that everybody else has, but you know what, I want you to get out of this alive, and this is how you're going to get out of this alive, right? So I think that all of those things permeate the way that we educate, the way that we treat, the way that we work. And it really requires a complete deconstruction of what we're doing and a rebuilding of what we're doing to engage the material from a very different perspective.
So Sylvie, now that I've got you warmed up, how do you feel about fielding a few from the audience?
Absolutely.
And Anna's been looking at the chat to see what questions are emerging there. So I'm gonna see what you got, Anna.
Okay. Wow, this conversation is exceedingly profound. Thank you so much, Sylvie and David. It looks like that the chat comes in here is that I think more comments. Elizabeth was asking how to spell out the word weird. So Sean was helping out this white educated.
Yeah, WEIRD, like the word weird. So it's white, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Jacqueline has a comment and a question for you. Jacqueline Rose, would you like to ask the question?
I was just kind of curious for the psych majors, for people that are in the psychology classes, because that particular college at Antioch is so big that if those professors are trained in this particular concept to bring it into the classroom, or is it part of the hiring process of making sure that the professors that come into Antioch are doing that for their students?
So again, I can only frame my answer in what I'm directly familiar with. So the short answer to that from where I sit is no and no. So, I think unfortunately in higher education in particular, doctoral programs will often train people, to do a little teaching here and there. And then, you get your doctorate and then you are knowledgeable and you're supposed to be able to go out there and do this. Pedagogy is not something that many institutions of higher learning focus on. I mean, it is not an area that is often paid great attention to. So people are asked about what they do. People sometimes describe what they do, but, realistically, not so much. And then in terms of the hiring of faculty, it is not something that the university has universally incorporated and included in its faculty hiring. I certainly think that this is an issue that, will be taken up by the Anti-Racism Task Force as an area that needs to be looked at very carefully, because I think that so much of this is about recognizing that there is an art to teaching. There is an art to creating an environment for students in that classroom that is inclusive. And it's, and so much of it is not only what is said, but what is not said, what is responded to and what is not responded to. And gaining an understanding of that takes work. I think that, some of the early work of, folks like Paulo Freire, currently the work of Bettina Love, who, if you want somebody to blow your mind, read Bettina Love. Granted, her work is mostly in K-12. She talks about abolitionist teaching, but she talks about the soul murder of children of color in our public school systems. Literally uses that terminology, and it's true. And then we, as people in higher education, often are inheriting people whose souls got murdered in the K-12 experience, who then walk into higher education experiences only in some cases to find that continue to perpetuate. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you, Sylvie. Next, I think it's a comment. Lisa Lepore, would you like to make a comment?
Oh, I just brought up neurodiversity, so I always think about neurodiversity and recognizing our students who are neurodiverse and how they struggle as well in classroom settings and faculty.
Okay.
Anna, I think Clarence had his hand up.
Okay. Yes, Clarence, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I wanted to verify I was in the right meeting. Is this the Sylvie Taylor for
That's
President 2024 committee meeting? If it's not, I do have a question. I just would like, first of all, thank you, Sylvie, for bringing up the point that the vast majority of folk come from, you know, collective cultures, because I look at my race and culture and it begs me to ask the question, are you training clinicians to actually meet people where they are, like teachers are taught to do? You know, are you actually looking at this, are you training these students to look at where the person culturally comes from, place and space, environment? I don't know what you teach psychology students, because I'm not one and I will never be one. I am crazy enough for everyone, so it's up to me to kind of like heal myself. But I'm just curious because, you know, when you earlier said something very important historically, when you mentioned that, you know, so many people, especially people of color, you know, if you look at slavery, and I you know, I don't apologize for always bringing up 1619 and slavery, because it is a fact, it's an American fact, that you had a collective number of people who came from different places, different cultures, spoke different languages, and had different ways of being with each other. So if I am a student in psychology and I am going to, you know, address the needs of the wellness, the mental wellness of a subject that is of color, am I first going to look at what region of the world do they come from? What are their cultural practices? What are their religious affiliations, if any? You know, what kind of nucleus family do they come from? Do I start to prepare myself with that subject by asking those questions, or do I simply sit there and address what the textbook has told me? Because I don't know how you guys approach teaching psychology students.
So I think, you know, that's an excellent question. And I think there's a great deal of variability in that. You know, I think that one of the real challenges that people who are training mental health professionals have not reckoned with at the level that they need to is how are we even approaching and having these kinds of conversations? You know, most clinicians start off being trained with like, what brought you here? Right? We don't have good language. And I always challenge colleagues, oh yeah, we do. Really? What is the protocol for talking with someone about their heritage and their background? And, you know, we're great at talking about symptoms and this and that and the other, not so great about those foundational things. I think the other thing that is extraordinarily problematic about the ways in which mental health professionals often, just like other human beings, because they're human beings too, tend to approach their work, is they make all kinds of assumptions, which is extraordinarily problematic. So often they make phenotypical assumptions, right? So, you know, a lot of people probably don't know this about me. It's not something that I wear on a t-shirt. People get really upset. I'm biracial. My father's African-American. People don't know what to do with this, because that's a lot of people don't see. A lot of people see me as just another white woman. Why is she talking about this? Well, that's not my heritage. That's not my background. That's not my identity. I can tell you in the world of mental health that I've walked in, people, you know, have never asked me that. Right. So I think that we have real challenges about that, because I think, you know, a lot of the work of Kimberly Crenshaw often also comes into this notion of intersectionality. So is it important to Sylvie that she's a woman, or that she identifies as straight, or that she's biracial? And what does that mean? And oh, by the way, her mother's French. And what's important to her? Is how old she is important to her? Is what, you know, because realistically, there could be 6 others of me, and we could all have other things that are front and center, and that could change tomorrow, right? What becomes front and center, right? I mean, I certainly, for example, use a personal example. You know, I have a 25-year-old son, almost 25-year-old son. When I look at what happened with Dante Wright, and when I look at the footage of George Floyd and so forth, my identity as a mom comes front and center, right? That's where my heart is right now. It may not be where my heart is next week, right? But I think that's the piece that we have to engage with. I think how this is done in the classroom varies greatly, because I'm going to be honest, there are no real standards. Everybody talks about being culturally competent, and that's just code speech for we're going to throw everything in a bin and we're going to call it culture, and we're going to, you know, we're just going to pretend like we know something. And, you know, it makes me insane when people use the term cultural competence, because it assumes that you're going to be able to check a box and you've arrived. And this is work that is ongoing. We're never going to be fully competent at this, like maybe we are at driving a car. There's too many variables. So I hope that answers your question, Clarence.
Yes, indeed. But let me,
when I'm not running.
for let me just throw this out there, since you brought it up with the current situation. Of these 154 mass shootings that we've had over this last year, I just wanted to remind people that when you hear the media commentations, when it is a person who is not of color, they always start to question the mental illness and the motive. You never, ever, 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 ever hear them questioning the mental wellness or the motive of a Black man. I just want you to sit with that question. There's no need to
absolutely,
but just sit in that. Yeah.
To be honest with you, you know, that's one of the places that raises my ire, because where are the voices of the mental health professionals? They're pretty silent. You get a little comment here and there on some website, and then people move on and allow, you know, I don't know, allow whoever the talking head of the day is to do an analysis of mental health. And why aren't mental health professionals demanding that mental health professionals be interviewed? There's very few of them that ever show up to do an analysis of these things. And you're absolutely right. We also, you know, I think the other thing that goes without saying is that, you know, again, when I talk about decolonization, looking at power structure, looking at systems, right? So I always say, whenever there's a mass shooting, I always say to people, what you should be doing is writing your Congress people and saying, you need to refund the CDC to study gun violence. For the last 20 years, the CDC has been precluded from studying gun violence. So not only can they not tell us about mass shootings, they can't tell us about suicide by gun either. Right? And yet, you know, we just kind of let it go. So thank you very much, Clarence. It's good to see you. And I'm not running.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Sylvie. And I see the CC, you have a hand up, but let me take a couple questions from the chat first, okay? Gabriel K has a questions. Gabriel, would you like to ask your question about clinical psychology setting?
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much. By the way, this is blowing me away. I asked, how do power relationships that occur in the world impact the dynamics within a clinical setting, and how can this be addressed appropriately? So, yes, that was my question.
That's a tough question. So I think that there are a variety of ways. I think that we have to recognize that, you know, we live now more than ever within a global society where the dominant paradigms of individualism and the Western world dictate how everybody else functions. You know, you've got the G6, the G8, you've got a small group of people, a small group of leaders who get to decide by divine whatever that they get to determine who gets to do what and where, right? So I think that that's a piece of it. I think the other piece of this is the absolute denial of people's history and roots. We rewrite history, you know, as if, slavery was okay. It's not a big deal. You know, it wasn't a big deal, right? Or whatever was done in this country or anywhere else in the world towards any group, is really not that big a deal. So if we look internationally, what's going on? I can pick two examples. You look at Syria and you look at Myanmar. And we have, as quote unquote developed nations, essentially said, gee, that's too bad, thoughts and prayers, but we're going to look the other way. And that is something that happens all the time, because somehow the lives of those people who are not among the chosen of the planet are not as important. If that kind of stuff was going on in Switzerland, everybody would, would be apoplectic on an international level among the power brokers of the globe. So I think, I think that the place where that trickles down is really understanding that level of disconnectedness, that level of marginalized experience, and that's how it's often seen, oh, gee, that's too bad, right? Trickles down to the work that we do in a classroom. You know, we often are not that curious about one another. We're often not that curious about what are the things that shape the way we see the world. And understanding that from a perspective of people who may be immigrants, of people who may be descendants of immigrants, who, may have had, life experiences that are outside the comprehension of the average, quote unquote, ordinary American, plays itself out in incredibly important ways. And I think that one of the real challenges is that in psychology, particularly in the clinical applications of psychology, we are often more ready to assume the experience of a person of European descent as being reality, and the experience of someone who belongs to a marginalized group as not being so. And that is dangerous. I hope that answers your question, Gabriel.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
And if I could, I'd like to just add one thing to one of the points that Sylvie was making. I know we're about out of time, but to the question of that curiosity, right? And that what I often see happening is when you awaken the curiosity and you get somebody to be interested in curiosity, their interest is in answers. And that's also problematic. So,
Yeah.
so now I have an awakened curiosity about fill in the blank, African Americans, lesbians, whatever it is. And what you're looking for are answers to what those things are and who those people are, rather than a curiosity that opens up to ongoing conversation and ongoing questions and exploration. And I see this all the time, you know, that the way in which these assumptions play out, that, oh, now I know, right? I read a few books, now I know.
Right. And I think, you know, I always fall back in the work that I do on something very simple. There's a whole lot of ways to manifest being a human being. Right. And there probably aren't any two of us that manifest our humanity in the same way. And I think when we can really honor that and respect that, something different occurs in those interactions. I think it's also incredibly important for us to recognize that our own life experience frames the way we see the world and the way that we interpret what we see. I'll give you an example. There's this activity that is often done in the society and the individual class, and often done in a way that I personally don't like. And I've done something similar. So people are supposed to bring in a cultural artifact, right? And then they're supposed to talk about it and what it means to them. And everybody goes, ooh, ah, right? And it's like, okay, I don't really get that. I've done that activity with people, and I have everybody bring it in a brown paper bag. And I used to make everybody sit outside, and I would lay out all the artifacts on the table, and I would have people come in and pick something that was not their own and then talk about it and talk about what they thought it meant. No one ever got it right. And then it's like, now let the person who is the owner of that talk to you about what it means to them, so that you can recognize and understand that we all see the world through whatever filter of our experience, our culture, our heritage, etc. And it's not a universal share. And I think that is, I think that that's the place that we also need to walk, particularly as professionals.
Okay. All right. We can see that we are 5 o'clock now, but we'd love to take a few more questions.
Sure, I
CC?
can hang out. I'm not, nothing ever. I'm happy hanging out if people want to hang out. I've got at least another half hour or so before I have to do anything else. So I'm happy to stay.
All right. CC, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Sylvie and David. I've been reading a lot in the realm of depth psychology lately about this idea of a supreme pathology occurring in the human species, or that we've been dealing with for a long time, that has a serious blind spot and unconsciousness around many things and the way that we're destroying the planet, and certainly within capitalism. And I was struck by this idea of poisoning of the soul and the psychological imprisonment and soul murder, and these things that we do as oppressors. And in terms of psychology, I think it's really an interest, well, it's ironic to me that, you know, white people, who a lot of indigenous people and people of color have thought to be pathological, like the people of the Black Hills looked down at the white people panning for gold on their knees, you know, staring at this shiny substance, and they thought they were completely insane. And so, and Freud, he came from a perspective of drug abuse, and he was incredibly neurotic. And so I feel like it's important for us to acknowledge that we as white people do the majority of the pathologizing, and that there needs to be some humility and some decentering of that power structure, because I think that we've been, the problematic and deluded ones. in so many ways. So I think to come from that perspective could be really helpful in terms of humility and a kind of a decentering of the ego.
So I guess I'm not sure if there's a question there, but I want to, again, full disclosure, say I've never been a big proponent of psychodynamic work, depth work, etc., because I've often worked with, in my own practice and worked with populations that folks who do that don't really talk to very much. So I just want to sort of frame it that way. But I think that one of the other real challenges that we have to consider and think about is how much their cultural appropriation is also going on. Right? There's an awful lot of that going on in a lot of the work where people, borrow from traditions that are deeply rooted in other cultures and like kind of, okay, I'm going to do it this way. I'll give you an example of something that sticks with me. I was watching a documentary and they were talking about, health practices, around the world. And the interviewer was talking to a group of students who are at the premier institution for studying yoga in India. And one of the students said, so the interviewer says, well, a lot of people in the United States, have started to practice yoga, etc. And, I'm wondering what you think. And one of the students said, well, I've visited America and I don't understand what you people are doing with yoga, because you do yoga in spaces that have mirrors. And yoga is about the practice of looking inward. So why would I have a wall of stuff that makes me look outward? Right. And it was very powerful because, again, we take a tradition, we twist it, we commoditize it, and the kind of notion that I am going to teach yoga and monetize it, right, and create lines of clothing for it and so on and so forth. And all of these students that are in this documentary are outside. They don't have mats and fancy clothes, and they're outside on the grass doing yoga, and the ground is not even, and so on and so forth. And I'm watching people, assume poses that I'm like, gee, I don't even understand how somebody got into that position. And, but again, I think that we have to also, be mindful of that. Right? Sort of many people, for example, from indigenous communities of the Americas, the concept of owning land, you are a steward of the land while you're on it. Yeah, we're sitting here running around buying little postage stamps of land. It's mine, and I own it. No, you don't. You can act like you do, but you don't really. Right. So I think we have to be mindful of those concerns and considerations in our work. And, this is not easy to do because we are taught from the time that we're little. I remember that song on Sesame Street. So Sesame Street came out like I was past the age to watch Sesame Street, but I watched enough Sesame Street with children that I babysat for and so forth. And there was that little song, one of these things is not like the other. Three of these things are kind of the same. This idea that culturally we are about identifying differences and often marginalizing those differences. And we do that with human beings.
I just want to, I'm sorry, Sylvie.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, I just want to remind everyone that it's 5:08 now. We typically officially end our event in an hour. So if you would like to stay, please, you're all welcome. There are quite a few more questions on the chat. We will continue. And if you have other commitments, so please feel free to leave. And we would love to see you back on next Monday. The next question on the chat here is that I think Sandra Canny made a comment. Sandra, would you like to speak for yourself?
Yeah, hi Sylvie.
Please.
Hi, how
Hello.
are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Very thought provocative. Addressing framework. What your thoughts on addressing frame? I put a little thing on the
Yeah,
chat based on the books, but
so there's the addressing framework, there's the respectful framework that, you know, people often use to sort of think about, you know, how do we consider diversity in the work that we do? You know, I'd like to add a little ripple to that. You know, I emphasize more community psychology and prevention and so forth. And George Albee, who's considered the father of prevention, talks about dimensions of diversity as places of exploitation. That this is where we marginalize people, and the act of marginalizing anyone as a function of some identity group is actually exploitative of their humanity. Really powerful. You know, remember when I first read that, I had to sit and think about it. But it's true, because what we tend to do is we either, you know, sort of create structures where we have to, you know, we're going to consider these things, but people are going to have to go by our program anyway. So, you know, and I think one of the things that's problematic when we think about clinical practice in particular, you know, there's a whole lexicon, you know, people who aren't psychologically minded, not engaged in the process, blah, blah, blah. Where is the what I'm offering does not work for that person? And I need to change. The work that I'm doing needs to change rather than that person needs to get with my program, right? And I think that that's the piece that we don't do very much of. And what does transformative practice look like? What does that look like? And does it have to be one-on-one or in a small group, or, you know, whatever we call counseling, psychotherapy, etc.? And, you know, at least in the time that I've been in this field, there haven't been lots of very substantive conversations about that. And I think, you know, we need to have them. And what might something more transformative look like? And what does the curiosity of a clinician look like? Where, you know, we talk about meeting people where they are. We meet people where they are, provided that they, you know, I mean, if you think about it, this is one of the things, people often laugh when I say this, but you think about the arrogance of mental health practitioners that we have disrupted the time-space continuum and redefined an hour as 50 minutes. That is the height of the enactment of that colonial idea, where I'm not going to honor your sense of time. You have to live by my sense of time. If I'm going to provide a human service, but you have to come to me on my timeline, in my space, in my place, right? That's enormously problematic. And I always, back in the day when I used to do supervision, I was like, you know what, you're doing home visit, because you know what, when you walk into somebody's house, you're going to learn more about them in 5 minutes than you will in years of therapy with them, right? So I think we have to, you know, I think we have to become mindful about that. At one point in time, I used to do supervision with students at one of the sites that we have in LA. This was a long time ago, before I came to Antioch. And I was the most unpopular supervisor, because I was like, you know what, you all are going to have to live and breathe and function in this community for 2 weeks before you get a client. You're going to take the bus to supervision. You're going to shop here, whatever. And people are like, there's no fruit at the market. Okay, deal with it. There's no bank. Okay, what does that mean? The bus came and it was raining and it left me, and 3 buses went by full and didn't stop. So what is that going to mean when your client comes in and says the bus didn't come? Are you going to talk about that as being resistant to the process? Or is that a possible potential reality in your mind now? Right? And we often don't do that. And I think that that's the other piece of this, that the monikers that we provide for people for whatever dimensions of diversity that they live in are within our own mindset. We don't know what that means to that individual, to that person. So, you know, if I meet someone who identifies themselves as Black, that doesn't necessarily mean that I know what that means to that individual and what their experience has been, because the experience is extraordinarily diverse. And I think that's what we have to honor. And frankly, I'm of the mind, all that crap about working with this population has got to go. We have to start to think about what is it, if in fact there is such a thing as being a human being, then how do we work to explore what someone's humanity means and let them define what's important. So.
Well, and if I could, I
Sure.
love all of that, but I also like, I want to flip the coin over for a second too. You know, like right. So for the whatever we want to call them, the mainstream person working in the field of psychology, meaning, you know, cis and white and middle class and whatever. Recently, I've been reading the work of these Argentinian scholars, and they wrote this piece called oh, I had it, here it is, about citizenship instead of citizenship. And what they're interested in is what they call the urban sanitation imaginary. And it's this interesting piece about, well, how do you deal with shit? And how does the urban sanitation imaginary not include our shit? And it's just too rich to not have it be a metaphor as well. So for me, I've been thinking about it as, you know, the citizenship and the psychological imaginary. And some of the points that they point to is that, you know, we don't engage physically or psychologically with our own shit. Right? Citizenship is, you know, your shit is not your own problem. It can just be flushed away. And the reason I'm raising this is I think it's provocative and interesting in a lot of ways, that how from the position of privilege within the sanctioned halls of legitimated psychology and therapeutic practice, our own shit can just be flushed away.
Yep.
Our shit is not a problem. Everybody else has to deal with shit. And how that then just jacks the whole program. So it's not only not understanding others, it's not understanding oneself, because all of that is just hidden away. And so that privilege of not having to deal with one's shit. I just wanted that in here somewhere.
Yeah, no, and I think, you know, I think that, you know, there's a number of scholars that are particularly educators. There's a couple of guys and their names escape me. I'll have to, it'll come back to me in a moment. But there's a couple of professors that have developed an entire course, and the subject matter is bullshit. And like all the bullshit that we do in academia and in education and whatever, that doesn't mean anything, but, you know, it gets reified because we can. And it often is stuff that highlights the distance between people who are marginalized within this society and the work. You know, and I think a lot of this really has to do, you know, with pedagogy. Like how do we teach this, right? So for example, if we are going to recognize that there are many cultures that are rooted in oral tradition, why the hell are all of our assignments about writing papers? Because I know some people who can riff on a subject talking that will blow the room blow people away. You force somebody to put that on a piece of paper and it's lost because of the conventions of the writing, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what's the point? What's the goal, right? So I think that we have to sort of think in the deconstruction of all of these things in terms of how we do education. You know, psychologists are big on these ridiculous simulations, or these kind of, let's go explore this and let's go explore that. Like we're going to the zoo and looking at, the gorilla in a cage, instead of, delving deep into sort of experiential learning, perhaps with a twist. One of the things that some colleagues and I have been talking about, and I think these are really interesting assignments for psychology classes, is in the area of ethnographic fiction. So it comes out of traditions of anthropology with the idea that a person is given a scenario and then you go off and do the research. And then if you're going to write or if you're going to present or describe, you embody the experience of that person based on the research that you have garnered about why someone might be behaving the way that they're behaving. And, a lot of the research on this is indicating that has been some of the more transformative work that students have experienced in their classes, because it connects the power and the privilege of the society to the work. And it's just not about Mary being anxious anymore, right? And I think we have to sort of think about that. And I think we also have to think about implicit bias that exists in the way that we talk about things, right? So, a faculty person says, an African-American student in my class, my first question is, why is that relevant? Why are you making that relevant? I've never heard anybody say a white student in my class. So how is that all of a sudden relevant? Like, what's the relevance of that? And, maybe there's meaning, maybe there isn't. And is meaning being made where it doesn't belong? Right. So I think that those are also issues and concerns. I think one other piece of, the shit, if you will, that's important to also think about, is that I think that we are also equally not willing to sit in the pile of shit with other people that they have to sit in. Because, if we think about it, there's whatever we personally bring to the table, but there's also, how do we frame and think about as educators the never ending volume of shit that people of color have dealt with just in the last year? Just, where is that? And again, thoughts and prayers, not good enough. Not good enough. Where is the I can connect from my humanity to your humanity? And that kind of, and I think the other piece of this that's so important is moving away. Another part of the shit that I think we need to get rid of is all that crap about people feeling guilty or made to feel guilty or whatever. White guilt, some people want to call it whatever. Enough already. Not about you. Let's move on. It's about we. We all live in this. So I think we have to be able to think about that as well, because we often aren't having meaningful conversations because we get caught up in that other repository of shit that people have, right?
Thank you, Sylvie.
People.
Okay, thank you, Sylvie. I would like to invite Sarah Fell. Sarah Fell made a comment on the chat, and also she has her hand up.
Thank you, Anna.
Him, sorry, yeah, him, yeah.
My question was, sorry, I was so involved in the what you were saying, I forgot what my question is. My question was, are there any good examples of clinical practices that are something as a reference point for a way to do clinical psychology in a decolonized manner, at least so far?
again, I want to sort of frame this in, I don't profess to have a comprehensive knowledge of everything that's going on everywhere. So I want to start there. But, I think that, some of the work that I've seen, which is phenomenal, is in many of the spaces where, for lack of a better term, polite clinicians don't tread. So in California, the state has done enormous investment through Prop 63. Those of you who aren't familiar with it, anybody making $1 million or more gets taxed an extra 1%, and from the million up, all that money goes into public mental health. And what they have done is, rather than the county or the state, et cetera, funding everything, they've basically said, we're going to fund, organizations that know how to do this in the spaces where they are, and have expanded understandings to be culturally appropriate and culturally relevant. So there are, for example, all across the state of California, organizations that serve populations where curanderos or medicine people, et cetera, are part of the programmatic work, right? There's an agency that I've worked with on and off throughout the years in Los Angeles that serves largely Asian American populations, predominantly folks who historically have immigrated from, or their families immigrated from China. And they have an entire piece of integration with mental health that includes Chinese medicine, Qigong, Tai Chi, includes acupuncture, et cetera, includes things that are traditional. And their approach is, we're going to work with people to figure out an integrative way to address what's going on, and not necessarily assume that therapy is your go-to. And I think that is genuinely has the potential to be transformative, because I think that we need to be mindful of the fact that, before therapists came along, I mean, I'm sorry, human beings have been around a lot longer than before Freud showed up. And, things got taken care of before Freud showed up. And if where we are right now in the United States is any indication, I don't know that we're doing that good a job with all of this. So really honoring and respecting culturally relevant and respected traditions alongside of, or perhaps in place of, is important. And I think we don't talk about that enough. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was very helpful.
Let's take a question from Gianna. You made a comment on the chat.
Yes, it's been a while. Let me refresh my comment. Excuse me, I was, as Surafel was, I was deep in thought based on the conversation. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that from my experience, I'm a post-colonial scholar, a professor in the humanities, and I've been working with a lot of indigenous histories lately and looking at the cultural framework for white privilege and colonization of the native peoples, South, Central, and North America, and also the representations of otherness. And what I've been finding, as many of you know, it was just that, yes, other cultures don't tell their history like a Western style of history. And I just wanted to make mention of that in regards to the conversation about what do we do when we go into even collect information from a client, for example, in the psychology realm. The addressing model is one way, but I find that many people do not respond to those kinds of questions, and they're not comfortable with exposing parts of themselves just so that we can know them better. And so in regards to that, just remembering that from my studies and understandings, the West is who wrote the history of the world, and other cultures don't tell their history the way that we tell it for them. And I just thought that was an important, just a side note.
Well, and I think, I think related to that also, I mean, some of our, sort of exploration of brain science and so forth is also providing ample evidence for the fact that the way, if we look at people who are raised in individualistic societies and people who are raised in collective societies, the way in which their brains respond and react to information is very different. There was a really fascinating study that compared Americans to people in China. And there were prompts that related to people's mothers and family members. And what they found was the portions of the brain that are activated among Americans are completely different than the portions of the brain that are enacted when people who are Chinese are prompted with things about their mothers. And certainly, some of these researchers were looking at empathy and things like that. And the regions of the brain that get stimulated when there's a threat to self for Americans are stimulated for the Chinese subjects when the threat is to someone in their family or their community. So I see the threat to an other as the same way that I see it to myself. So we have to, we've got to be able to start to deconstruct those models that tell us how people function in the world, because they don't function in the same way as, in terms of culture. And that does not mean that it is, that somehow it is less than, and I think part of what needs to happen is we need to begin to start stripping our language when we talk about human beings as mired in difference. Those people are different, because that always means a reference point. And I think that becomes a challenge, because then once I establish that reference point, which is the superior perspective, rather than it's just another manifestation of being a human being.
Mhm.
And it may be one that I don't understand and that I need to have somebody school me on. And I think that's the other piece. We've got to figure out how to develop more humility and get rid of the hubris. And that's tough, because when you add punctuation and letters at the end of someone's name, the hubris skyrockets and the capacity for humility starts to fade very quickly.
Wow, thank you so much, Sylvie. This is amazing. I think we're all deep in thoughts on this topic. But now I'm looking at
actually I wanted to ask you, Anna, before you left. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
There was a question that a girl was waiting for quite a long time, McKenna, that she put in the chat. And I was wondering if you could address that for the recording, just real quick in a short answer. And McKenna had asked, what advice would you give to current students that are trying to advocate for more decolonization work to occur in the classroom?
I always love ending on a tough conversation. I think that from where I sit, there's a fine line. I think that students need very much to own their education. But I think the slippery sliding slope becomes when, and I'm going to, one thing that I didn't say at the very beginning, which I'm going to say now, if you hadn't noticed, I'm really direct, so I'm not going to mince words. I don't want students to get caught up in the laziness of faculty who don't want to do the work. It should not be a student's responsibility to educate someone who is supposed to have knowledge of content. It is the responsibility of the faculty member to get smart. And if a faculty member doesn't get smart, maybe they need to go do something else. I heard a woman talking about cops. And I'm like, I'm going to use her quote all the time. If you can't handle the stress of being a cop, maybe you need to be a greeter at Walmart. If as a scholar and as an educator, you can't handle broadening your knowledge, then maybe you need to be a greeter at Walmart. Because I think that particularly in psychology and particularly in a discipline in the sort of way that it gets manifested at Antioch, where mostly it's about people who are training to go out in the world and work with other people, it is dangerous to not do this. And we should first be doing no harm. And, you know, I am not convinced that harm doesn't get done. The history of what has happened to marginalized people, there's lots of harm that's been done. Families have been destroyed, children have been taken away. You know, all kinds of things have occurred disproportionately to people of color at the hands of mental health professionals. Not to mention that psychologists have a history of falsifying data and doing all kinds of stuff. If you want to read a great book, The Mismeasure of Man, that was written by Stephen Jay Gould, who was actually a graduate of Antioch College, talks about how the entire history of psychological testing was designed with falsified data to document the inferiority of Indigenous people and Black people. You know, Binet, as in the Stanford Binet, wasn't so kind, let's say, to folks. So there's a history of this that exists and that permeates this discipline. And it's important for people to get smart about that too, to recognize and understand that, you know, psychology has not always been this benign enterprise. And while there's never been stuff, for example, that shows up in the DSM specifically, that has often been weaponized, particularly for people of color.
I want to say yes to a lot of what you said, Sylvie, and offer a slightly different perspective on at least one thing. Certainly, psychology's history is problematic, to say the very least, when we're talking about race or women or sexuality or any of that. But to the earlier question, I take your point that faculty need to educate themselves, and that should be an ongoing undertaking throughout the course of a life. Where for me it feels a little different is, you know, I encourage my students to participate in that education of me. Right, that in the classroom, it's not just me having done all the work and then, okay, I can show up, but my students constantly take me to school and show me things that I hadn't thought about, and bring perspectives into the classroom that open up the conversation in ways that I wouldn't have considered. Even I'll make this confession. So, you know, my Politics of Psych course, which is, you know, I've been teaching for 20 some odd years, and the critique of psychology, and who psychology has been in bed with, and why things have turned out the way that it has, and how it could have been differently. And I think it was 2 years ago, a student said, so this is all great, Tripp, you know, I love this, and this is changing my whole view on psychology, but there's nothing in the course about decolonizing psychology.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, shit, now I've got something else. But then that sent me off, right, to begin to build up new knowledge in those areas. So I do think the last thing is I really do think there is a role for the student in educating faculty along with the points that you were making.
I think you're right. And I think we were kind of talking about the same thing. So let me clarify. It's different for a student to say to you, hey, David, this is all well and good, but you're not talking about decolonizing and da-da-da. And for you to go, okay, oh crap, I got to go get smart about this, versus why don't you do a presentation and educate everybody else about it and make the student do the work?
Sure.
That piece of it, I think, is where things get problematic. And to me, that's the lazy piece of it. I'm going to continue to do my thing the way I've always done my thing, and I'm not going to change, shift, whatever. And if somebody brings something up, then that can be their passion project, and I'm not going to pay very much attention to it.
Absolutely.
I think that's where it gets challenging and problematic.
And that's where I hear Audre Lorde's voice, that, fuck you, we're not carrying your water too.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, certainly Bell Hooks's work in Teaching to Transgress, very similar as well, talking about, get with it, people.
Yeah.
I think the other thing too that has influenced my work a great deal is some of the work of Ignacio Martín Bero in liberation psychology. And how can psychology be a discipline that liberates people from their oppression? And one of the pieces about that is so important is how do we support people in developing a critical consciousness? And I think that the lazy way of teaching is banking. I'm going to give you information, you regurgitate it to me, etc., versus I want you to really develop the capacity to think critically about this and to really look at everything with a side eye, because we should look at everything with a side eye. And sometimes we buy it and sometimes we go, whoa, wait a minute, that's really not going to work. And, I think that going back to the very original question about decolonization is really also beginning to say, again, from more of a liberation psychology perspective, that the owners of the narrative of people who've been oppressed in the society, that narrative should be written by people who are oppressed in society or spoken by people who are oppressed in the society, because that's where the expertise lives. And the person who sits in their educated power and privilege. And I say that because I think we have to also recognize that no matter where we came from, when you have benefit as a faculty person of spending time in whatever ivory towers you spend time in, your way of seeing the world has been transformed by that experience. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the people you serve or talk about have had the same privilege. And I think that, we have the potential of wielding great power when we talk with students. And I saw something in the chat from a student about not being failed or etc. And I think, I want to be really honest with you. I think that's an area that this institution needs to work on, because education gets weaponized and we have to recognize that, and that is what abolitionist work in education is about. It should not be a weapon. And if we are in fact going to be social justice educators, my job is to ensure that my students are successful. And if a student is struggling, it should not be punitive. It should be, how do I connect with you, and what work do I need to do to support you in being successful? So for me, what that means is, if a student is struggling with a concept, let's meet once a week, let's meet twice a week, let's talk about this, let's banter this around, let's figure it out. And I think often it's easier to say you're failing, because then I don't have to do any work. And that is not what social justice transformative education should be about. That's colonization. You don't belong, you don't fit in, you're punished for not being able to regurgitate to me what I banked into you, versus as an educator, my role is tied up in your success as a student, and recognizing that not every student in my class is going to take to the material in the same way.
Okay. Well, Sylvie, I'm aware of your time. It's 5:43. There are a couple more questions on the chat.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay.
I'm here. This is
All right. Nicole Crenshaw, you made a comment. You have a are you still here? I think I think you are here. Okay. Go ahead and make your comment or ask your question, Nicole. You have to unmute
Oh, you're talking
first.
to me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, I didn't know you were talking to me. Sorry.
You
Go
have-
ahead, Jack.
You need to unmute. Let me see.
Oh, I'm sorry. My question, I was just adding a question to the discussion on decolonizing education. And I just wondered if there's any groups out there, because, you know, I just realized on some of the research I was doing about history, the history of Civil War history in particular, there's groups out there and organizations and businesses who are actively promoting and publishing books of history that are not accurate and putting them in schools, specifically a huge company in Texas, which I don't want to name.
Yeah, Texas textbooks are frightening for sure.
And are there groups out there, like, are we trying to rectify this? Because this has been going on, according to my history and research, since the Lost Cause campaign after the Civil War and Deconstruction period. It's never really stopped from there.
Right. So I am going to, I'm trying to be cool about this. Here we go. I'm going to stick in the chat the Abolitionist Teaching Network. This is a group that is spearheaded by Bettina Love, but that's what they do. They're about how do we clean up the mess that is, you know, misinformation and disinformation that is out there, and how do we, you know, create their focus is K-12, but there are a lot of folks that are in higher ed that are also gravitating to that group and probably will begin to sort of contribute in that space as well. And they are, it's a pretty cool movement, if you will.
Okay. All right. I think Sylvie addressed the questions from EF about how to avoid failing. But EF, do you feel that you still want to respond to Sylvie and make a comment about how she actually covered your questions?
I feel like the answer addressed professors and how to not do that to their students, rather than like, what do you do when the institution's holding your degree hostage based on you complying with what they want?
You know, I think that I'm going to be honest with you. We don't have really well articulated processes and procedures. You know, I think that each campus has catalog information about challenging evaluations and so on and so forth. And frankly, they're bureaucratic, you know, and I think that, you know, this continues to be an area that I think calls for a great deal of improvement. With that said, I think it's important for students to look at what are the processes and procedures that exist on their given campus, within their given department, on their given campus, and then what is available at the sort of higher levels of administration. I think, you know, one of the things that happens in many institutions of higher learning in this area is the fact that I think students, to be honest with you, get worn down by trying to fight whatever the issue particularly is. You know, I think that one of the things that has been talked about in the anti-racism task force, particularly among the leadership, but that certainly is something that I think the university needs to think about, is having an office of an ombudsperson that really is there to address and redress at a higher administrative level, the kind of concern that you're raising. That is something that is very common in higher education. And, often folks in those roles are not tethered. They don't sit under a dean. They don't sit under, they have kind of independent ability to evaluate these kinds of concerns and considerations in the sort of stream of an appeal and that kind of thing. And I think that is the place in higher education that I have seen these kinds of concerns and considerations handled the best, because universities that have effective ombudsperson's office, the ombuds people have the ability to tell a faculty member, knock it off, have the ability to tell administrator, knock it off, or you can't do it this way. And they get to render an independent judgment outside of the sort of departmental hierarchy. So I think that is something that we need to strive for. At the same time, I know that is a wholly unsatisfactory answer for a student who finds themselves addressing this kind of issue in real time. So what I would, strongly suggest is that, whatever the processes are that exist on your campus within your department need to be, you need to look at that and carry that out. And then, determine where does it go beyond, upwards and outside of. And, I think this is something that, this is not the first time in a messy conversation that we've heard this question. So I think it's an ongoing issue for many students, and we need to address it at a broader level at the institution. So I hope that helps.
Yeah.
And it's okay if you tell me no, I get it.
What was, you said ombics? My sound isn't amazing.
Yeah, we don't have that capacity, but traditionally what exists in many institutions are an ombudsperson. So they are kind of they're sort of like the higher level, the higher level adjudicator of these kinds of challenges. So it goes outside of the infrastructure.
Okay. All right. Any more questions from the audience? We're 5:51 now. Thank you so much, Sophie.
My
Boy,
pleasure.
you really extend your time with us.
My pleasure. This is my stuff. I love this stuff.
So this is amazing. I mean that you led us into deep thinking and re-questioning about how we approach education. What a great conversation. Thank you. And David as well. I mean, I think it's so true is that it's not so much laziness with the faculty that they can't handle all the diversity. It's very often is how much do we know about other culture in this world that's so big, right? So the best way to approach is humility. Is that anything I don't know, I learn from the students. And that's
I want to share real quick, because I know we're ending, but I just want to share a simple slide that I use often when I talk with people about this and questions for educators to ask themselves. So I'll just put that up for now. Like to really think about that reflection as an educator. And, we're all in different places and all in different spaces. But I think particularly it's important in psychology, for example, for us to really think about, where are we in the spectrum of seeing ourselves also as educators?
Sylvia, I want to add my voice to the words of thanks to you for this incredibly rich conversation. The fact that we have exceeded our usual time expresses the depth of interest that your conversation has stimulated in so many ways. I think that you and David are the perfect match for each other in the questions and the answers and the very thoughtful way that the two of you have interacted here today. And I thank you both.
Yeah, once upon a time, this is not David and my first rodeo. Way back when, remember when we were doing Thinking Pedagogically, he and I would try to get to read stuff and talk about it.
I know, and this is
barely remember that far back.
But this is why the conversation model that we use here, it's really wonderful. And I felt that especially today, because the way in which you interacted with each other, first of all, took it into very deep dimensions and then stimulated so much interest, so many other questions. And that is a great conversation. So thank you very, very much.
My pleasure. It was fun.
Yeah, when you want to go into deep dementia, I'm your guide, Kirsten.
I think this is the longest messy conversation we ever held, if you all remember. And think about, we still have 15 people here. So this is the first time. Well, Sylvie and David, great job. I mean, this is amazing.
Well, I'm always happy to come back. So, if David's willing, David and I could have a conversation about a whole bunch of stuff.
Well, for real, right? And even on this, what we didn't get to around research and selection and interventions and just so much. It's so rich. So
yeah.
How about a workshop? I'll think about it. How's that? But for sure, I am happy to join you. Those of us from the Anti-Racism Task Force join you. So by all means, I'm happy to chat with folks again, because this is fun.
Okay.
Thank you, Sylvie. It was a lot
All right. Thank you, Sylvie. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks for coming.